Hi, everybody. Whew. First time back at a conference in a couple years. Hopefully this goes well. My name is David Morris. I'm a columnist at CoinDesk, and I'm here with Daniel Huang from F2 Pool and Kevin Zhang from Foundry Digital. We're going to talk about the geopolitics of mining. Just to set context really quickly, I'm sure you're all familiar, but we've had some major events over the last 6 months or so with China's major crackdown on crypto mining within its borders, and also El Salvador not only adopting Bitcoin, but laying out some plans for doing mining domestically. So this kind of sets the stage for a discussion about the larger stakes of policies that nations might set, or how nations might consider crypto mining as part of their competitive advantage or disadvantage, depending on their mindset. So I would like these two guys to, and I guess FYI for anybody who's looking for him, Whit unfortunately was unable to be here today. But I would like each of our panelists to introduce themselves and maybe give some background on the work that they and their organizations have done, so we can go into the conversation kind of knowing where everybody's coming from. Dan, you want to start?
Yep. So I lead special projects at F2 Pool. So we're a large POW mining pool. Some background on we've done a lot of work around education. We've also been tackling the ESG issue head on, as well as helping with introduce more decentralization to the system.
Yeah, sure. First of all, I'm digging the microphones. Feels like we're back at karaoke night. But I'm Kevin Zhang. I'm the VP of Business Development for Foundry, and I primarily focus on the Bitcoin mining side. So a little background on Foundry. We're the fourth wholly owned subsidiary of DCG, which is short for Digital Currency Group. And DCG is always specialized in bringing institutional adoption into the crypto ecosystem. If you aren't familiar, DCG also wholly owns Grayscale, which is largest digital asset manager in the world, Genesis, which is the large prime broker, all things financial services in our space, CoinDesk.
DCG also owns CoinDesk, so if I'm extra nice to Kevin, it's because I have a conflict of interest.
Yep, so CoinDesk, so in the news side as well. And we also recently acquired Luno last year, which is the Coinbase for developing nations. DCG has also invested in many different portfolio companies, I think upwards of 180 or so. And all that's to say, DCG's had a very deep reach in this ecosystem, but the one thing that was missing was something on the infrastructure side. When we mention infrastructure, that's talking about supporting both the proof of work and proof of stake protocols. So we primarily focus on the hardware and the physical nature of things. On the staking side, we do have our staking team that's here with us today. So if you want to stop by after the talk and figure out what we're doing on the staking, feel free to meet up with our team afterwards. We're targeting, they're going to kill me for saying this, but I think we're targeting 20 protocols that we're going to offer staking as a service by the end of the year. And on the mining side, we offer 4 different services. I know it's a little long-winded, but we've done equipment financing. We financed a large chunk of the S19s and M30Ss that have come into the US. We've deployed a lot of our own units for mining. We also offer advisory services for newcomers, especially institutions that have capital and have access to power, but don't know how to navigate this tricky landscape. And at the start of this year, we also launched our mining pool, Foundry USA Pool.
Great, thanks. So I want to start by talking about kind of a question that is from the perspective of changes in China recently is sort of antiquated, but I think still interesting, because before the big purge of miners in China, one of the topics of conversation within the crypto sphere was, is there too much mining in China? And people would sort of measure the share of mining taking place there, and this is specific to Bitcoin, but I think applies more generally. And so the question that I would put to both of you is to, and kind of the source of the anxiety was, if there's too much mining in China, do they have too much influence? Does that region have too much influence? And so I guess I would ask both of you to maybe address that in general terms. What is the impact of geographic distribution on governance in particular and control for different systems? Does it matter? Does it not matter? Have we worried too much about it over the years?
I guess I could go. So, just to put out that, I guess F2 Pool had been started in China and is the largest Bitcoin mining pool in the world. And then obviously the geographic I guess, exodus that has come, I would say, in my opinion, is overall net positive for the resiliency and robustness of the Bitcoin network. I think that's quite obvious. And I would even say that, right, if once like the seesaw, right, if there's this migration, all these miners are right now on like these container ships, reaching their new destinations or where have you, like it might as well just be another, right, pendulum swinging to like there may be another region that is just as influential, and so it's like maybe it's an opinion of who do you think you want all this hash rate power coming from. But I think we are now seeing much more geographic decentralization. Just for some context on that, in let's say taking a note from like the proof of stake ecosystem, right? There were some proof of stake based chains that did suffer from geographic centralization at both the geography level and also the cloud service provider level, and those chains they halted, and there's been a lot of initiatives to redistribute that centralization out into.
So to agree, it's about risk. Overconcentration is also a risk.
Yeah, and I guess in terms of like the type of governance, at least at the POW level, right, it's right there's people who need to make those types of changes at the network level, and I would say that from what we have even seen also on Ethereum, right, there you have to kind of go with what the general community desires, instead of what you think that large service providers are kind of dictating or whatnot, because like we can use the Ethereum and Ethereum Classic example, right? There was the whole code is law, stick with ETC, but the community ended up using Ethereum, and that's what we have today. So,
yeah, Kevin, you got any thoughts on?
Yeah, so I'll just add in a quick take, which is so Bitcoin mining proof of work at its essence is the monetization of energy, and in a network where you're always targeting the lowest source of electricity and the lowest ability to access power. Oftentimes, it's not about Satoshi created this incredible system where people are actually incentivized to be good actors, right? So over the history of Bitcoin mining, it largely has been concentrated in China because they had an abundance of power. A lot of manufacturing took place there, and at any given time, there's over 50% of the network controlled by one or two pools. One thing people don't realize, Bitmain actually owned Ampool and BTC.com for quite a long time. And if you add the two hash rates together, it was over 50%.
Yeah, that's what got cited all the time as like,
Right.
This is too much.
Right, but I think one of the big key differences now is that now that Bitcoin mining is in the limelight, Bitcoin is pushing another $1 trillion asset class. The energy consumption and the proof of work protocol, that's being scrutinized a little bit more. And ultimately, when you're trying to get institutional adoption, you have to tackle these narratives in the headline level, right? And it's very easy for someone to say, oh, Bitcoin mining is boiling the oceans, this or that. Or nowadays you have these really obscene takes where Bitcoin mining waste is being weighed in grand pianos. You can definitely tell there's a lack of information that's out there. So tackling these headlines at a very high level, one of our goals at Foundry was to help bring more decentralization, bring more access to miners and resources to miners within other regions outside China. Even though it wasn't so much of a practical security risk, it was an optical and a social risk. So
That's a great point about like real risks versus perceived risk, and sometimes the perceived risks are actually still important. So just one very quick question pursuant to the rest of the conversation. So obviously miners come in a lot of different forms these days. You have mining firms who do it on a sort of corporate level. I think that depending on what kind of chain you're talking about, you do still have kind of bedroom miners, people who are running machines in their basement. And then you have pools, which you guys both represent, which is kind of somewhere in between the two. Could I just get both of you to kind of just a quick check-in on the changes that have taken place in the makeup of that mining mix between, obviously, it's a lot harder for somebody as an individual to productively mine Bitcoin now versus 7 years ago or something. So just what you feel about that.
Sure. So I think there's a very obvious shift in the market participants. Not only do you have geographical shifts with a lot of miners exiting China now with the most recent crackdowns, but the profile and the demographic of the miners that are in this ecosystem, they're becoming more institutional. They're access to more traditional capital, like the capital markets. And my most recent project prior to joining Foundry was a natural gas power plant that was a struggling, peaking natural gas power plant in upstate New York. They tapped into the Bitcoin mining economics to keep their power plant online around the clock to mine Bitcoin. And when the energy grid called for it and the energy prices spiked and they needed to provide stability, they shut the miners down and they provided stability to the grid. So you're seeing this profile change of more institutional market participants. And I think because they're going to have access to cheapest form of energy, you're going to see a large shift towards nation states, sovereign wealth funds, as the kind of the new participants in the guard for Bitcoin mining.
Yeah, I think it's definitely changed, and what Kevin said is absolutely true. Like I started as like a hobbyist miner 8 years ago, but it's definitely right. You have to have ASICs. You have to have access to high quality, reliable energy that is cheap. Yeah.
So, Kevin, you mentioned sovereign wealth funds, nation states, et cetera, and that was the next question was, if each of you, for example, was going to a president, a governor, a senator, and trying to make the case for, you should want mining in your jurisdiction, you should maybe even promote mining in your jurisdiction. I'm curious what your pitch might be, and it, we're talking a little bit before the panel, and we mentioned Venezuela, and obviously Venezuela does have the particular example of, because they have stranded energy, they have a potential application there for it in crypto. But I would maybe, we'll get to that. Sorry, I was getting ahead of myself. But what's your pitch for a nation state to try and attract or support crypto mining?
Sure. So Bitcoin mining, we talked about this before. It's just one of those buzzwords out there. It really is. It could be a battery pack for the grid, right? Oftentimes, for retail and commercial use of power, energy usage spikes throughout the day when people are awake or when it's during the daytime. But oftentimes at night, energy will go in and consumption go in a lull, and Bitcoin mining is around the clock, right? So I mentioned the example about Greenwich, the natural gas power plant, where they were only online maybe less than 10% of the year. So the other 90% of the year, you could be mining Bitcoin. So it provides another alternative energy source or revenue source for your power and your electricity. And it also provides stability to your grid, especially with sustainable power. It's oftentimes billed 9 to 10x the actual consumption that's needed at peak times. So there's a lot of redundancy, and especially where there's stranded and wasted energy, you can capture all that and monetize it.
I think that is a fantastic point that Kevin makes. Is like that type of load balancing that miners and Bitcoin miners can provide to localities, right? I think Texas is used as a fantastic example where in the summer times, like people are running their AC, and then when there's a demand, then the Bitcoin miners can just turn off. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious if you have any thoughts, and this is a little bit out there, but what about, Venezuela is an interesting example because I'm sorry, not Venezuela, I keep saying Venezuela, El Salvador is an interesting example because it is in some ways, it does have some restrictions in its relationships with the international monetary system because of its dependence on dollars, but its inability to print them. So does, the Bitcoin generates revenue abstractly, but is there an advantage potentially to a country having Bitcoin specifically, since it is this separate thing from the mainstream financial world? And I apologize if that's a stumper. This was not on the list that I gave.
No, I think they need to have the right type of people communicating the type of information. I think unfortunately there weren't certain like people sitting at that table. I think the entire Latin American region has been watching them closely, and F2 Pool has been doing a lot of, and I've been leading a lot of the work in the Latin American region for access to green energy, for example, right? Like Paraguay is home to the second largest hydroelectric power plant at Itaipu Dam, and they have been obviously definitely taking a look at what El Salvador is doing. Eventually, like Honduras ended up having those same conversations with El Salvador, and then you have like Bolivia and Uruguay and Paraguay. But what is interesting is that to bring it back to the type of attention that those regions are getting, not just from like the monetary level, but if like these sovereign entities, these sovereign nations are trying to attract or have people come in and start setting up these like mining farms, they have to do it in a transparent and maybe even regulatory compliant way. As an example, we've been helping with, there's some minority leaders who are trying to create like virtual asset mining license bills, right? And they at one point were trying to create these without any input from any of the crypto ecosystem, which is where like we had to come in and say, hey, like, it's going to be affecting us. It's going to be affecting a lot of miners who are going to be migrating into Paraguay to get access to that. And so, it has to be done. If we can do it in a way that satisfies both those sovereign nations or whatever regulations that they have, and it can be done in a non-oppressive way for the mining farms, miners, and also the pools that are aggregating that hash rate, that is going to be a net win for our reputation, like the whole crypto ecosystem's reputation. Because you don't want to have miners just come in, like, they're looking for refuge in a new place and then say like, oh, I'm operating a sneaker store or sneaker manufacturer, and then they're actually running miners, right? And that's not going to be, that's not how we should be proceeding.
Yeah, it's a really good point, the need for somebody to interface with all of those institutions and governments. But Kevin, do you have a thought about the Bitcoin itself as a useful thing for governments to have access to because it's an alternative system?
Sure. So just real quick, I'm being a little nitpicky here, but you mentioned that the value creation in Bitcoin is a little bit abstract. Well, I think with mining, it's anything but abstract. It's very tangible assets, right?
Oh, I just meant in the sense that you can sell it for dollars, sell it for pesos,
Gotcha.
whatever, but versus having the crypto specifically.
No problem. Obviously, Bitcoin mining is near and dear to my heart, so I get pretty defensive. But no, I think one of the arguments for why it makes sense for El Salvador to mine Bitcoin is not only do they have a lot of cheap sources of power, but it's a cheaper way to generate Bitcoin as opposed to just buying it on the open market. I think the president there was tweeting that he was buying the dip last night. I think that's terrific, right? But if you have access to cheap power, you can source your Bitcoin at a cheaper value, right? You can be more cost competitive in sourcing your own Bitcoin. But at the end of the day, the flows that come from mining are actually pretty minimal. There's only 900 Bitcoin that are mined a day. And even if El Salvador was to leverage its entire grid and to get Bitcoin mining up in a big way, it's going to take a long time for them to gain significant market share. But yeah, an alternative way to source Bitcoin is a great way to support an ecosystem in a country and jurisdiction that already recognizes it as legal tender.
So you both are part of pools, and I wanted to talk about that, particularly from the perspective of kind of community. And this is not something that I'm really familiar with, so maybe just talk a little bit about how pools operate in terms of sharing business intelligence and operational insights, and in particular in terms of I don't know how mobile the miners within your pool might be, but are they talking about where they want to locate or where the electricity sources are?
Yeah, so I'll go first on this one. So there absolutely is a lot of collaboration and communication between our pool partners, our customers, and ourselves. Oftentimes, especially with the Chinese exodus of miners, there were a lot of miners that are looking to move overseas. And although we couldn't fabricate and create energy and infrastructure out of thin air readily available, we were able to tell them who are the actors in the space that we find credible, who are the hosting providers that we trust and can actually stick to a timeline that they promise, and who they should work with. So there's that information flow and the networking that comes naturally. Another thing that I would mention is when it comes to combating a lot of the energy FUD and the climate change type of damages are attributed to Bitcoin mining, it's actually very critical for us to actually get the right data and the facts out there because they're largely on our side. So it's working with the miners, participants on our pool to share the data and the analytics to combat these narratives because they're completely taken out of context and perspective.
Yeah, I agree. It is education that is very important, and I think pools are at a level where they have expertise globally, and they can communicate that to miners. Again, Paraguay, Texas, the Nordic regions, and those are all localities that we have a lot of depth in, and we were able to like help manage that, right, in those certain environments. And I think what Kevin mentioned with like the whole ESG criticism, and we talked about this earlier, like, right, it's very easy for people to just completely dismiss crypto with like a one line of, oh, crypto or Bitcoin is burning down the planet. Proof of work sucks, and stuff like that. But yeah, if people have the right understanding of what actually goes into the nuances of the type of energy being used, there's actually for Compass who couldn't join, there's actually a fascinating video by Compass like that Zach had hosted, where they were actually talking about how certain efficiencies, even using non-renewables, are supportive of the ESG criteria narrative. So that is a nuance that not many people are familiar with, and people would love to kind of just dismiss. Kevin also made a really good point about how good behavior is incentivized, and especially within the Bitcoin ethos of like, why do miners mine? Like when I was mining, like I wanted to make money, right? I wanted to make money even though we had no idea what was going on, right? Bitcoin miners mine, that's their primary motive. And then the secondary effects of that is all of the decentralization, self-sovereignty, censorship resistance that we enjoy. Maybe there were miners in the beginning that were like, yes, I want to contribute to this decentralized network because I believe in decentralization, self-sovereignty, and censorship resistance. But now, as we've gotten, as Kevin mentioned, right, much more institutional, there is a very clear goal for these miners. But then we also benefit from, right, the fantastic consensus mechanism and the system that has been built, right? We benefit from all those.
Right, the motivations are built into
Yeah.
the system, and so people just are acting in their self-interest, and you get
And
that result.
even within the ESG criteria, right? So, right, a lot of people have basically said two things, right? In order to battle this ESG narrative or this ESG criticism, there's people move miners to renewable energies, right? There's like the whole Elon consortium of like, let's move.
Can I stop you
Yeah.
for 1 second?
Yeah,
Because I want to spend our last few minutes talking about ESG, because both of our panelists were very interested in that. But before we move to that fully, I want to ask one last question sort of from that nation-state perspective. So if you're China, or if you're some other jurisdiction that doesn't want miners and gets rid of them, and China is able to do this because they have a very authoritarian top-down system, and they're able to just tell people what to do. But what do you feel like China is missing out on long-term, or any other country that either disincentivizes or shuts out miners? Like, what is the downside to that? What are they missing? What are they losing? Other than financial, maybe.
Yeah, so I think it's a good question to ask, and we touched on it before with like Bitcoin mining is the monetization of energy, right? And in a particular province like Sichuan, right, where predominantly the power is all hydro generated, you have thousands of hydro dams that are disconnected from the national grid, and the energy is stranded and otherwise wasted. So you're cutting off a complete source of revenue for all these different power plants, and you're hurting yourself economically, right? I think that's a big key piece of it. But also being relevant and being on top of these cutting edge technologies. Now, at a conference like this, Bitcoin may be looked at as kind of a legacy type protocol, but it is still cutting edge, right? There's a lot of stuff being developed on Bitcoin that these countries, by taking away the backbone of what it's being built on, they cut themselves out of the system.
Yeah, it is like, if there's energy being wasted, then you can store it in, as people have said, like a battery, a Bitcoin battery.
And I mean, setting up an ASIC, for example, is cheaper than an actual battery, I think. Maybe. I'm guessing.
Depends on how much people demand it.
Right. So yeah, we do want to turn to, I think, a really intense interest of the panelists here, and of course mine, which is everybody is worried about Bitcoin using a lot of energy, right? And that has often been deployed as an argument against it. And I'm wondering in particular whether that is something that comes up in your experience when you're talking with local authorities, jurisdictions, doing the groundwork of preparing them to have miners come in, or managing that relationship. And then we can move on to maybe a little bit of why that's not a great argument.
I think what we've also seen in, let's say, for example, in Paraguay, where they have hydroelectricity is that there's sometimes not a lot of great infrastructure that's been built to transport that energy. And so when people like mining pools or mining farms or even individual miners come in and they want to be able to set up shop, they end up bringing a lot of money in to support building that infrastructure that not only just helps them, but basically the infrastructure development plans of that region. And right, so that's at that level. At the ESG level, right? As I was saying, like good behavior must be incentivized, right? Bitcoin miners are incentivized to mine because they make money, and we benefit from those secondary effects. We can frame that same concept or ethos into renewables, right? Like if we want people to mine using renewable energy, then we have to incentivize them somehow. I know that there's a network, Hathor, for example, for miners who mine and provably mine with green power, green energy. They actually incentivize them with tokens. How long that can last is another
I mean,
question.
some might say that's overcomplicating it, though, because if you look at it at the big picture, renewable energy is less expensive. And so then you have motivations for people to go and grab that, for example, with the dams or... Kevin, you want to chime in?
Yeah, sure. So I think a lot of it is, once again, just getting perspective, getting the right data out there, and correcting a lot of narratives. So NYDIG had a really excellent research that they put out recently with Nick Carter, and it's something that I've been saying for a while, which is like if you take the total electrical consumption of all the Bitcoin miners in the world, it's less than 0.1% of the entire world's energy consumption, which is less than all the dry tumblers out there in just North America alone, right? So that's something, it's important to keep perspective there. And then in working with our pool customers, our pool partners, and others in the ecosystem, we find that if you actually analyze the energy mix of what's going into Bitcoin mining, a lot of it is actually largely is renewable or carbon emissions free.
Yeah, I can't really cite the source at the moment off the top of my head, but the number that I'm familiar with is that about 33% of Bitcoin mining energy is renewable right now without any really legislative action to make that happen, just based on market forces.
Yeah, which is already larger than many other industries. Right, and then you have a lot that's stranded or otherwise wasted. And then you have access to nuclear power plants, right, which is, once again, emissions free. And I think what's really cool about Bitcoin mining is our CEO says, Mike Collier, he says this all the time, where Bitcoin mining is ruthless in its drive for cost efficiency. And I think a lot of the natural frameworks or incentives are already there, where sometimes the cheapest energy sources are emissions free, whether it's nuclear, solar, hydro, whatever the case may be. Bitcoin miners, like we mentioned, they're financially incentivized to chase the cheapest energy source. So it's going to further accelerate the implementation of these better, quote-unquote, greener energy sources.
I think we are just about out of time. Either of y'all want to make a final comment about why people should have Bitcoin mining in their backyard?
Oh, in their backyard. So
Or, I mean, metaphorically.
Sure. So yes. So I think once again, it's Bitcoin mining is a monetization of your energy, right? Especially if you have stranded energy or energy that's inefficient, not being utilized at times. A lot of times, the infrastructure for for electricity has been built decades ago. And as many different businesses have shifted overseas and there's less manufacturing in your local jurisdiction, you can recapture a lot of these economic incentives again and monetize that energy that's otherwise dormant.
Yeah, and I would just add that, right, we can tackle this ESG criticism head on, education, and right, switch to renewables, and then maybe offset the rest.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. And thanks to Kevin and Dan. And that is it for us.
Thanks, guys.